In the summer of 2012, a team of archaeologists in Leicester, England, dug the first trench of an excavation beneath a municipal car park. They were looking for a medieval friary. What they found, within hours, on the very first day, was a skeleton. It was curved into a shallow grave, spine visibly twisted, hands still crossed at the wrists. The bones were old. Very old. And the moment the team got a proper look at that spine, that unmistakable scoliotic curve, one name surfaced immediately. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, dead since 1485, missing for 5 centuries. The tests that followed confirmed it. Carbon dating, battle injuries, age at death, everything lined up. The bones matched a king. The discovery seemed to close a very old case. But there was another round of testing still to come. And this one wasn't about the spine. This one was about the blood. The moment the DNA results arrived, something broke. Not in the skeleton, in the dynasty. The Y chromosome, the genetic signature that should have run clean and unbroken through the male Plantagenet line, did not match the living male line descendants at all. And the DNA doesn't tell us where the break happened. It just tells us it did. To understand why that result matters, you have to understand who Richard III was supposed to be and how completely history thought it already knew him. Richard III is one of the most infamous figures in English history, and almost everything people know about him comes from one source: Tudor propaganda, crystallized by Shakespeare, the hunchback, the child murderer, the scheming usurper who killed his nephews in the Tower of London and seized the throne through treachery. This image was deliberately constructed by the regime that replaced him. Henry VII, who defeated Richard at Bosworth Field in 1485, needed Richard to be a monster. The Tudors needed the Plantagenets to be illegitimate, corrupt, unworthy. So that's what the chronicles said, and that's what stuck. The physical deformity was part of the story. Medieval and Tudor writers used bodily abnormality as a kind of moral shorthand, a twisted body as evidence of a twisted soul. Scholars largely accepted that the scoliosis had been real, but exaggerated. The location of the burial was also treated as settled, at least theoretically. Richard had been interred at Greyfriars Church in Leicester. The church was later demolished. The site was built over, but the general location was known. Nobody had seriously gone to look. And the lineage? That was simply not in question. Richard III was a Plantagenet. Edward III was his great-great-grandfather. The line ran through John of Gaunt, through the Dukes of York, and finally to Richard himself. This was genealogy. It was documented. It was drawn in careful heraldic trees and confirmed by royal record. It had been settled for centuries. The bones matched. The history matched. But one test remained, and it didn't. Here is the thing about genealogical records. They track names. They track titles, marriages, children, successions. What they do not, cannot do is verify biology. A genealogical record says that a certain child was born to a certain father. It records what was believed or claimed at the time. It says nothing about what actually happened in the bedroom. DNA does not make that assumption. And remarkably, until 2012, nobody had ever tested the Plantagenet male line against genetic evidence. No one had extracted a Y chromosome from any known Plantagenet remains and compared it to living male line descendants. The idea simply had not been done. Royal genealogy was a paper science, documents, chronicles, heraldry. The genetic dimension did not exist yet, and even once it became possible, the question was not asked. That was the blind spot. Not stupidity, not negligence, just a gap that nobody had thought to fill, sitting quietly inside one of the most studied dynasties in history. The Leicester team set out to fill it. But this is where the difficulty of the science becomes its own kind of story. Ancient DNA from medieval bone is not a clean sample. It degrades, it fragments, it gets contaminated by the soil, by bacteria, by the DNA of every person who handled the remains across centuries. Extracting anything usable from a skeleton buried since 1485 requires careful, painstaking laboratory work. And even then, success is not guaranteed. But the bigger challenge wasn't the skeleton. It was finding the right comparison. To test the Y chromosome, you need living male line descendants, men who carry the same unbroken paternal lineage from a known common ancestor. Finding those men required a completely separate research track, genealogical detective work running across 5 centuries, tracing male lines forward through dozens of generations, eliminating branches that died out, following the ones that survived. Eventually, 2 male line descendants were identified, one in Canada, one in Australia, both tracing their direct paternal ancestry back to a common Plantagenet root. So now you have 2 tracks, a degraded medieval skeleton and 2 living men on opposite sides of the world. Both tracks have to work. If the DNA from the bones is too damaged to read, the test fails. If the genealogical research has a flaw, the comparison is worthless. Either one collapses the whole thing. The first results came back on the maternal line, mitochondrial DNA, passed through mothers. The team compared Richard's remains to living female line descendants traced through the same genealogical method. The match was clean, the maternal line confirmed. The skeleton was Richard III. Everything was working. Then the Y chromosome results came back. The maternal line held. The paternal line did not. And those are not the same kind of problem. Here is the result, stated plainly. Richard III's Y chromosome does not match the Y chromosomes of the living male line Plantagenet descendants. Somewhere in the line between Edward III, who died in 1377, and Richard III, who died in 1485, a son in the official record was not biologically fathered by the man history says was his father. One break, one non-parental event, clean and unambiguous in the data. The researchers were careful with their language, as they should be. They used the term false paternity event. They did not say fraud. They did not name anyone. The break could have been the result of an affair, a secret the family never knew about, a child quietly accepted without question. These things happened. They happen still. What the DNA tells you is simply that somewhere in that 140-year window, the biological and the documented diverged. Now, here is what makes this impossible to dismiss. The mismatch is not a borderline result. It's not a statistical maybe. The Y chromosomes are clearly non-matching, not weakly similar. And the mitochondrial conformation on the other side means this cannot be explained by contamination, sample mix-up, or laboratory error. If the sample were contaminated or misidentified, both tests would be wrong. Only one is. The result was peer-reviewed and published in Nature Communications in 2014. It holds. What it rules out is significant. It rules out an unbroken legitimate biological male line from Edward III through to Richard III. It rules out the assumption, held uncritically for centuries, that genealogical documentation equals biological reality in royal succession. And it reopens, without resolving, a question that nobody in 1485 could have asked. Which ancestors in this line were actually whose sons? The researchers identified 5 generations in which the break could have occurred. 5 generations of Plantagenet men, any one of whom might be the point where the biological line quietly departed from the written one. Some of those figures carry more historical shadow than others. John of Gaunt, Edward III's formidable son, has attracted attention. His mother, Philippa of Hainault, was the subject of some contemporary whispers, though the evidence is thin. Others have pointed to later in the line, toward Richard Duke of York and his own recorded parentage. But the DNA cannot target any specific individual. It can only define the window, and the window contains kings. If the break occurred early enough in that span, before certain rulers rather than after, then the claim those men held to the English throne rested on a lineage that was already, biologically speaking, severed. The Wars of the Roses, the most violent succession crisis in medieval English history, was fought by factions both claiming legitimate descent from Edward III. Both sides were prepared to go to war over the purity of their blood. And beneath it all, invisible to every person fighting and dying over that question, there may have been a fracture that made the entire argument moot. History's most devastating legitimacy war, possibly built on an illegitimacy nobody knew existed. This is not a story unique to England or to Richard III. The Leicester case was striking because of how famous the subject was, but the pattern it revealed is not unusual. Studies of other European aristocratic lineages have found similar results. Gaps between the documented record and the biological reality. Non-paternity events quietly lodged inside dynasties that staked their entire authority on the cleanliness of their blood. The estimated rate of false paternity in pre-modern populations runs at roughly 1 to 3% per generation under normal conditions, and possibly higher in contexts where political pressure shaped whose name appeared on a birth record. Across enough generations, in a line long enough, a single break becomes statistically unremarkable. What is remarkable is that nobody thought to look, that the tools existed for years before anyone used them on the Plantagenet line, that a car park in Leicester had to give up a skeleton before the question was finally asked. To be clear about what remains uncertain, the study cannot tell us who. It cannot name the man whose father was not who the record says he was. Speculation about specific figures is not supported by the DNA alone and should be held lightly. What the DNA does is fix the boundaries of the problem. It confirms the fracture. It narrows the window to 5 generations. And it permanently ends the assumption that the Plantagenet male line ran in clean biological continuity from Edward III to the last king who bore that name. What no one can say, and what may never be resolved, is whether knowing this, had anyone been able to know it at the time, would have changed anything at all. Whether the armies that met at Bosworth Field would have laid down their weapons if they understood that the bloodline they were fighting over had already, silently, ceased to exist in the biological sense. That question has no answer. The bones are in Leicester Cathedral now, reinterred with ceremony, with a stone tomb and an effigy and the full weight of royal acknowledgement. The name on the tomb is Richard III. That part isn't in dispute, the skeleton is his. But the line, the blood, the dynastic claim, the thing that made a Plantagenet, that is now a question with no clean answer. The Y chromosome result hasn't changed. It will not change. It sits in the published record, quiet and permanent. Think about what the skeleton actually survived. 500 years under a parking lot, the demolition of the church above it, the complete reorganization of the city around it. It outlasted the dynasty it belonged to. It outlasted the Tudors who destroyed that dynasty. It outlasted every version of the story that was told about it. And when it was finally found, finally tested, the first thing it did was crack open the one part of the story everyone thought was settled. The spine was real. Shakespeare got that much right, buried beneath all the slander. The curvature was there, in the bone. But the blood, the pure royal blood, the unbroken chain, the legitimacy that kings killed for, that part turned out to be a story. Not a lie anyone told consciously, not a conspiracy, just a gap between what was written and what was true, passed forward through generations, until it reached a man in a shallow grave who had no idea it existed. Somewhere in the Plantagenet line, a child was born and given a father's name, and nobody questioned it, and the whole machinery of dynastic succession moved forward as if the record were real. And for 5.5 centuries, it was, because nobody checked. To understand why that fracture matters so much, you have to understand what legitimacy actually meant in 15th century England. Not as an abstract legal concept, as something men were willing to die for, kill for, burn cities for. The Wars of the Roses did not begin as a war over territory. It began as a war over a question: whose blood was real? The Lancastrians, descended from John of Gaunt, held the throne through Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. The Yorkists, descended from Edward III through a different branch, believed the Lancastrian claim was built on an illegal foundation, that their own line was senior, purer, more legitimate. And so for roughly 30 years, from the 1450s through the 1480s, England tore itself apart along that fault line. Battles, executions, attainders, entire noble families erased from the record over a single generation. The Battle of Towton in 1461 is estimated to have killed somewhere between 9,000 and 28,000 men in a single day, numbers that put it among the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, and it was fought, at its core, over the question of which man's bloodline gave him the right to sit on a throne. The obsession with dynastic purity in this period was not background noise. It was the entire operating logic of the political world. Every marriage was a claim. Every birth was a statement. A bastard line, a broken line, an illegitimate line. These were not embarrassments. They were weapons. They were the grounds on which a king could be deposed, a claim invalidated, a family destroyed. Richard III himself used this logic. When he moved to take the throne in 1483, one of his central justifications was the claim that his brother Edward IV's children were illegitimate, that Edward's marriage had been invalid, making the young princes legally barred from succession. Whether Richard believed this or manufactured it is still debated. What is not debated is that he understood exactly how the game worked. Bloodline was everything. A single question about paternity could unravel a dynasty. He knew that. He used it. And then, 5 centuries later, his own bones told a version of the same story back. Now. The 5-generation window the researchers identified is not an abstraction. Each generation is a specific man, a specific life, a specific set of circumstances that either did or did not produce the biological break the chromosome is recording. Walking through those generations is not solving the mystery, but it does show you how strange and how human the whole thing is. The earliest possible point is Edward III himself, or rather, his sons. If the break occurred at the level of John of Gaunt, that would mean Gaunt was not Edward III's biological son. The evidence here is extremely thin. Contemporary whispers existed about Philippa of Hainault, Edward's queen, but they were politically motivated and remain unsubstantiated. Most historians treat this as implausible. The DNA cannot rule it out, but the historical case is weak. Move forward 1 generation, and you reach John of Gaunt's son, John Beaufort, or the branch that leads more directly to Richard. Here the trail becomes harder to read. The records are detailed in some respects and completely silent in others. What the documents give you is the official version. What they cannot give you is what happened behind closed doors in the 1380s or the 1390s. Move forward again, and you reach Richard, Duke of York, Richard III's father. Born in 1411, he became the figurehead of the entire Yorkist claim. He died at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, fighting for the right of his bloodline to rule England. His son, Edward IV, went on to take the throne 5 months later. If the break occurred at Richard, Duke of York, if he was not biologically the son of his recorded father, then the entire Yorkist claim was built on a line that had already, silently, ended. The argument Edward IV made, the throne Richard III took. The wars fought on behalf of the House of York, all of it downstream from a fracture that nobody in the room could have known about. That is not a comfortable thought. It is also not a provable one. The DNA identifies the window. It does not point the finger. Any of these men, or none of them in the way we might imagine, could sit at the center of this. But here is the thing that stays with you. These men were not abstractions. They had mothers. They had lives that were documented in extraordinary detail because they were powerful. And somewhere in that documentation, somewhere in those careful genealogical trees drawn up by heralds, whose entire job was to maintain the fiction of clean bloodlines, there is a gap. A child whose father's name was written down, accepted, never questioned, because nobody questioned it, because questioning it would have been dangerous, because the entire political architecture of the period depended on everyone agreeing not to ask. And the bones in the car park finally asked.